very warm welcome on behalf of the team. This is the Facing Financial Challenges webinar. We'd just like to do a very quick test, if that's okay, that everyone can hear us. I've put up a slide which should say, if you're having trouble with the sound, please check the volume on your laptop is turned up or your PC. I'm just going to stay silent for a couple of minutes while people need to check this or contact Beth Ann Davis on their mobile number on the screen. Obviously, if you can't hear me, you won't be able to hear it, hence the reason why we put in the slide up. We haven't received any calls, so I'm assuming everyone can hear us loud and clear. Right, ar y rhan tîm ymarfer swydd archwilio Cymru, hoffwn ni estyn croeso cynnes I pawb sy'n rando mewn prawn yma. Dyma'r trydydd yn y gyfres ar y ddim wedi cyflwyno archwilio mewnol a hefyd reoli risg o flaen llaw. Mae'r recordau hynny ar y wefan yn barod â ni hefyd, ond newn ni sicr bod yr nodau yma yn cael eu crynoi fel rhan o'r nodau heddi. On behalf of the Wales Audit Office Good Practice team, can I extend a very warm welcome to everyone who's listening in, and also to some new colleagues who have joined us across Wales. We've got colleagues from local government, police, fire, health, central government, and we also have some independent members also listening in. This is the third in a series of our webinars. The recordings of the previous two, which are internal audit and risk management, those recordings are available online. We will ensure that we will put those recordings in order to complete the 3 to 3 webinars as part of today's resources. So without further ado, I'd now like to introduce you to our speakers. I'd like to introduce you to our panel, Anthony Barrett, who's the Assistant Auditor General for Wales Audit Office. Anthony, can I ask you to sort of introduce yourself to the listeners, if that's okay?
Yes, as Ina said, I'm the Assistant Auditor General. I'm responsible for all our financial audit work across Wales, and also a number of other projects that may come along.
Thank you. Mark Owen.
Hi, I'm the Head of Finance at Wrexham County Borough Council, and given I may be talking about Wrexham a bit throughout the questions, I'd just indicate that the Council has a net revenue budget of 227 million for the current financial year. I'm also Chair of the Society of Welsh Treasurers for the 2014-15 year.
Thank you, Mark. You're very welcome. I'm Guy Clifton. Hello.
Hi, I'm Guy Clifton. I'm Head of Local Government Advisory at Grants Forbes in the UK. Prior to that, I led on our value for money work for local government and healthcare, and I've been working in local government public services for over 20 years now. And I'm the author of the first 3 of our national reports on the financial health of local government in England, shorthand known as tipping point.
Thank you very much, thank you. I'll also, although I'm hosting this webinar, I'm also having an alter ego today. I'll also be responding and sharing the thoughts of Councillor Ben Curran from Sheffield. Ben would have loved to be part of this webinar today, sharing his thoughts of what's happened in his authority in England, but unfortunately couldn't join us. So I caught up with him yesterday, and I shall give a brief synopsis of what he shared with us. But he's also made it very clear that he's very happy for anyone to join him in terms of if he wants to have further discussions about it. So in terms of how this webinar is going to actually take place, there are 5 questions I'm going to ask the panel. You are very welcome to share questions, and if you've got any observations to make. Thank you to those who have already asked questions. In fact, question 5 is as a result of questions coming in from attendees in relation to reserves. So it kind of goes to show that if you do share your thoughts and observations, we are taking your comments on board, if that's okay. A couple of people have asked me some questions in relation to, I'd like to ask questions, but I don't want to be sort of said, oh, this is John Jones calling from Met Authority. Can I assure you, we do highlight your question, but we don't draw attention to who's actually asked the question. So what I'm trying to say in short, questions are non-attributable, because we really do like you to get involved in the debate. I'll also signpost when it's the time for you to actually ask, pop your questions in, if that's okay. So, without further ado, Anthony, can I ask you to share your opening remarks in relation to the theme of facing financial challenges?
Thanks, Ina. I mean, as everyone listening will know, public services in Wales are facing unprecedented financial challenges that may well go on for many more years to come. And against that background, decisions will have to be taken, in my view, around either what services are going to be provided and or how those services are going to be provided. And I recognise, as an auditor, there is no easy answer to those questions. And actually, the answers to those questions will be different in different organisations. And I think there's a couple of things that need to be considered here. When we talk about sort of medium-term planning or longer-term planning, we also have to bear in mind what is meant by the medium or longer term. If you look at the Wellbeing of Future Generations Bill, we're taking a much longer time span as a result of that. And if we were to say the long term is 50 years, then maybe the medium term is the next 20, 25 years. Having put that into context, clearly action needs to be taken now in the short term to deliver on some of the challenges. And I suppose from my point of view, there's a couple of elements. There's one is about organisations taking a strategic decision on a direction of travel, and then identifying whether or not it has the right people in place to enable and facilitate that change, particularly at a senior level. And if I take a different example, if you look at the private sector, you'll often see organisations that are struggling and maybe earnings and dividends are down. They'll often bring in a new chief executive, for example, or a new management team to help turn that around. Once those people have done that job, they are not the right people to see it through in a stable environment. So I'm not suggesting that we need wholesale change. What I am suggesting is that we need to look very carefully about whether we have the right people across the piece to be able to deliver on some of the challenges that are coming forward.
Anthony, thank you. Can I hand over to you, Mark, wearing your hat of Society of Welsh Treasurers? What's your opening remarks on that comment?
I think from a practitioner perspective, making targeted cuts on an annual basis is becoming harder and harder. We're only just into the austerity measures, and the diversion of resources to health, coupled with the increasing demand, the protection of schools, makes it even more severe looking forward. So we have to make more difficult decisions and engage in a package of measures to meet the challenges ahead. And to do that, we need the basics in place as well. So we have got to have sound, flexible, medium-term financial plans.
Thank you, Mark, for your opening remarks. Guy, can I turn to you in terms of what would be your opening comments on Anthony's remarks?
Well, I think that the question talks about delivering services in a sea of uncertainty, and uncertainty is the critical thing. And I'll echo Anthony's point around leadership and culture. For me, having the right leadership and culture in place, aligned to an agreed strategy and vision for the organisation, is probably top of the list. And that culture needs to align to that future shape, that future strategy, and that culture will not be the same as the culture that the organisation has now. So if you don't have the leadership in place, you're not going to change culture. And one of the things I would say is that nobody alive in public services, be they officers, be they elected members, has had to face the challenges that public services are going through at the moment. So nobody has got that experience. Now, one of the reasons I was asked to be on the panel was because of the work we've done with a lot of English local government and the perspective that brings. And it's very clear that if I speak to chief execs and finance in English local authorities, cultural change has been talked about for as long as I've been working in the sector. But you can see in their eyes they actually mean it. That we have to make that cultural change now. But it can only be done with effective political and officer senior management leadership.
Guy, thank you for that. I'd like to ask attendees now, if they have any observations or questions to ask the panel, please email them in on the box that you have as part of the webinar. In the meantime, I'd like to share some comments when I caught up with Councillor Ben Curran yesterday. When I asked him the same question, he said, really, there were two choices. He said, you either chose to manage a decline or you wanted to take the transformation option. He was very much that they wanted to go down the transformation option. He said, it's also really important that when we talk about transformation, this is a large cultural element to do with it as well. Particularly, he isolated the operational managers. He said, it isn't just about delivering the service anymore, but they were seen as enablers of change, particularly when you think that a lot of the services have been delivered in partnership or in collaboration. That wasn't something that they were quite used to, so do not underestimate the sort of the cultural aspect of it as well. Ben referred to a couple of examples of services that he'd been personally involved on, and he said he didn't advocate a one-size-fits-all approach, even though they said they were going to go down the route of transformation. He used libraries as an example. He said, not in Sheffield, they haven't closed one library, but what they've done is that they've sort of adapted they looked at each library and chose a model that worked particularly well for them. An example he gave me was that in one community, the library is still being run by the librarians, but it's been managed by the community. So there's a lot of cultural differences that the librarians have to come to terms with. In another community, a library forms part of a local pub. He emphasised very clearly that the adult books were in the pub and the children's books were in another part of the library, quite discreet from it. But actually, as an offer to the members of the public, it actually meant that the library was open on much longer hours, and so therefore had a better offer to the public. He also said that from a strategic point of view, they had set up outcome boards, and they were very thematic and holistic outcome boards. He gave me an example of one outcome board was called Successful Families. He'd very much expect him to say that social services and education would be part of that, but also would be skills and leisure. So he said very much a thematic approach. And for those members listening in today, he said he's very happy to continue and expand on how their approaches they took to that. If I may, I'd like to turn on now to question 2 to start a bit of getting the debate going about the barriers to change and success. Anthony, given the change that's going to happen in the Welsh public landscape, are the current systems sufficient to successfully facilitate these changes that are needed? What do you see are the barriers to these changes and also their successes as well?
I think if you are, change is not made without inconvenience, whether it is change for good or for ill. And actually, there's an awful lot of work involved in making change, particularly transformation change. And I think nobody should underestimate the amount of time, effort, and frankly money that might be needed to affect some of this transformational change, to the extent that, certainly from my point of view, it's not necessarily going to be cost savings today. If you're making transformational change, again, you're looking to at the very least the medium term in terms of this is what we're going to do. And that's why you need that medium-term plan to say we're going to invest now, even though we're in a time of austerity, because we're going to reap rewards later on. So I think that's a key issue. Don't underestimate the amount of time, effort, and money that's required for change. But also, it comes back to what I said earlier, what Guy was saying about culture. The extent to which we have the cultures within organisations today that we are going to need in the future to be able to deliver on some of that change. And again, I don't have the answers. If I had the answers, I could make a fortune writing a book about it or whatever. But I think, certainly as an auditor, I recognise the difficulties in doing that. And I think I'm on record before as having saying, if an organisation is going to miss a financial target in a given year, but it has plans to recover that in the medium to longer term to make, in effect, sustainable decisions, then that is something that, as an auditor, I would report, but I would support, as long as it's backed by that planning to enable that to happen.
Anthony, thank you. Can I move on to you, Mark, now in terms of Society of Welsh Treasurers? What's your views of barriers and changes? Barriers to changes, I beg your pardon.
Okay, well, I'm very pleased to hear Anthony saying that auditors recognise that organisations will need to take risks because they do need that space to try things out and not be criticised looking backwards. And clearly the complexity of accounting for some of the different delivery models that we've been moving into will be challenging for practitioners and auditors alike, really. Other barriers I've mentioned around the terms and conditions and funding streams that come to local government in particular. But I suppose I want to spend a bit more time on the successes, really, and what is needed to ensure that we can move into this new environment. And one of the key aspects is communication. That's communication with stakeholders, communications with the public, involving community councils. In Wrexham we have a Town and Community Council Forum, and we share each step with them. More use of social media, newsletters, and getting the younger generation involved. We've got a Senedd Ifanc, which is a young members forum. We've also got a member who champions community engagement, and I think moving forward we probably need to do more in terms of webcasting more meetings. We do the council and the executive board at the moment, and clearly this engagement can go on in informal settings. I know some councils in Wales have done it in car parks, in public buildings, facilities. I think it is important that we get proper budget consultation.
Okay. Mark, thank you for that. I'll come back to you, Mayor, on public engagement, because I think you've sparked some interest on some of the questions that are coming in on that. Guy, can I hand over to you in response to that, please?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. There should be a slide coming up on your screen with my thoughts on some of the barriers that we've identified in relation to the changes that English local authorities have been experiencing over the current Parliament. We've already heard from colleagues around the culture and the structural barriers, and I think I suppose the lack of joined up working and the maturity as a corporate body is one that I'd perhaps tease out. We've just finished a piece of work for an English Judiciary Council, and we were there to provide independent challenge on their savings within their current their budget for next year and their broader MTFP. One of the things that came out of that, and it wasn't planned when we went into the piece of work, was a lack of shared understanding of risk. So you would have a directorate coming forward, or chief officer coming forward with a series of savings options, and they would red risk them. And then what became apparent, that a red risk in one directorate might be the same as an amber or indeed a green risk in another directorate. So that sort of joint working, that joint corporate ethos and understanding is really critical. And that all sort of comes back to that structural barriers, having the right skills and capacity. And as Anthony was saying earlier, the resources do absolutely need to be prioritised into innovation and transformation. And you've got to make those resources available, because in England, local authorities that haven't done it have struggled just to deliver the day job, and you need to make sure that there is a reallocation of resource to manage and create the capacity for transformation and innovation. One of the things we've seen as well on the audit side is that governance often plays catch-up. In England, there's been the sort of increased rise in alternative forms of service delivery models. So sort of from joint ventures and leisure trusts and things like that, mutuals, and governance often plays catch-up. So we're doing a piece of work for a local authority in England at the moment, and the Cabinet had realised they've got so many ADMs that they really didn't understand what was going on in governance terms. So that group reporting arrangements and the systems and processes and procedures aligned. So governance, never forget about the importance of governance and performance reporting.
Thank you, Guy. When I caught up with Councillor Ben yesterday, he said there was one simple answer to the barriers, not answer, his observations were that sort of, as a Cabinet member, information was key, good information. And in order for them to have good information, they recognised, in hindsight, they wanted to make sure all their systems are aligned, internal systems, because you can only make decisions on the quality of the information that's provided to you as a Cabinet member. So his message was very clear to share with Cabinet members and members throughout Wales, was ensure your systems are aligned internally, HR and finance. He shared a particular sort of issue that they'd come across. They'd had a particular overspend in adult social care, but it wasn't flagged up soon enough. if information had been better aligned, then they would allow to got on top of the situation much earlier. So his message, simply ensure your internal systems are aligned. Do the testing, test the systems before you actually start on your transformation journey. Wearing my host hat now, I see there's quite a few questions coming in here. Anthony, can I come to you first? Because obviously there's been sparks going off here about some of your comments in terms of the challenges to the current workforce, and what about asset and estate management as well? You alluded to the cultural aspect of it, so they think, what's your thoughts about the impact it's going to have on the workforce?
I think there's almost a step back from that first, which is what are we going to do? Mark raised the vitally important point around public engagement, which is absolutely key. You're going to have to get buy-in from the community on the decisions, difficult decisions that have to be taken, and very difficult decisions will have to be taken to manage the finances. And that needs to be done in a way that is open and transparent. It comes back to the governance point that the guy was making. And people will be aware that I have had issues in a couple of authorities with governance and decision making. It's the importance of being open and transparent. People are not going to like, whether they are members or members of the public, some of the decisions that have to be taken. But that doesn't mean they should be taken behind closed doors. What should happen is sort of open and honest engagement that says, very simplistically, this is how much money we've got, that's what we can afford. This is how much everything currently costs. We can't do everything. We need to transform the way we deliver some services, or we need to cut some services. And so I think that sort of decision needs to be taken. And then that will give you an indication of what type of estate and assets you need to be able to deliver that service, and whether some of those assets should be transferred elsewhere under some of the alternative delivery models, and similarly with the workforce. I think there is a general recognition that public services, that people shouldn't expect to get the same thing from public services they have done for years. Things are changing, and probably changing permanently over the next few years.
Okay. Anthony, there's another question that has actually come in for you now, and it says, what can auditors and regulators do to provide the most effective support to the efforts of the public sector in Wales as financial pressure increases?
I think from an audit point of view, you would expect us to be challenging. So to challenge the things that you're doing and the way in which they're being done and the decisions being taken. I agree entirely with what Mark said about supporting organisations that take risks, and by that we mean well-managed risks. Certainly the Auditor General, and I would agree with him, is on record as saying that he would support organisations taking well-managed risks. That doesn't mean that things won't go wrong, they will. But it does mean that as long as organisations are open and transparent about the failures so that other organisations can learn from them, we're not going to jump down their throats if it was a well-managed risk. If it was not a well-managed risk, it was a decision taken behind closed doors by one or two people that's come a cropper, then we will still have something to say about that. More broadly, through the good practice work that we're doing, through these type of seminars, we hope to, and the shared learning seminars that we do, we hope to disseminate good practice in certain areas. And that's one of the reasons for wanting to bring Grant Thornton in today, a practitioner in from local government, but also a member from an English authority to try and learn from what other parts of the UK are doing.
On that point, Guy, can I bring you in and share sort of what's been happening in England in relation to this, please?
Well, sort of wearing our, I guess, Grant Thornton's audit hat, one of the things that we've really invested significantly in for our clients and the wider sector is what we call thought leadership. So we use research programs across our client base to produce reports and analysis on various subjects, including the financial resilience and health of local government. And one of the things that our clients have regularly asked us is case studies. It's Anthony's point about sharing good practice. So our reports all have case studies, and we started to do that for English local government, and then the call came back from the sector, that's great, but we'd like to get international case studies. So we've now started to include international case studies, and that really is important. There will be sector-led improvement through the LGA or WLGA, but auditors have that role, I think, to share best practice. We were commissioned to do a piece of work for DCLG, which was on best practice in local government savings, and we undertook that with a company called Shared Intelligence, and that was published the week before Christmas. And it's one of the few best practice reports, I think, that CLG has published under the current government. So that's really, really critical.
Thank you for that, Guy. Given your comments, Mark, about public engagement, we've had a question coming in saying, what's been happening in England in terms of sort of approaches to public engagement, Guy? So can I ask you to address that question?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I particularly liked is what Liverpool City Council and some others have been doing, and it's a web-based tool. And so citizens can go in and they can prioritise across all the different service areas. You've got the financial envelope, and then it comes out with what that means, what your decisions mean. And you go in and you can time and time again go in and prioritise, and it always comes way over the budget envelope. And I think that is a really helpful tool. The use of infographics, the rise of the use of infographics. Surrey County Council have been doing a lot of work on this, which is helpful both internally and externally to try and help the citizens understand what is a really, really complex planning and decision-making process. Rather counterintuitively, I think when you look at customer satisfaction at local authorities in England, broadly speaking, the trend has been upwards during the current period of austerity, as indeed has the engagement staff, or the staff satisfaction as well, both counterintuitive. But I guess one could argue that that's because of some of the positive public engagement that's been going on. But I do know it's also going on in Wales as well. I mean, Monmouth have got Digital Monmouthshire. I remember seeing a webinar where the portfolio holder was being filmed to sort of talk about the financial planning a year ago. So it's not just the exclusivity of English local government.
Thank you very much, Guy. Mark, can I bring you in on this?
Yeah, just very quickly on engagement, because we've had some successes this year, and as Guy mentioned, the Your Choice facility, which enabled you to decide what services you would reduce or increase, and trying to balance the budget, has been used by Wrexham. We did a full difficult decision consultation this year, which was online, involved a series of meetings. We had paper-based questionnaires. We had over 1,000 responses to that, which made it statistically significant in terms of affecting the decisions on the budget. As a result of that, there were changes to the budget, and then we've now carried that on to ensure that we don't just do this as an annual process, and we've got another consultation out at the moment asking the views of the public, and we've tried to use innovative ways. Again, we've had lead members that have used Twitter to get feedback.
Okay, thank you for that, Mark. Can I remind listeners that all resources that have been mentioned by the panel today will ensure that we capture them and share with you following this event. I've got time for one more question, and in fact I'm trying to summarise a couple of questions that have actually come in just now. So I'm afraid I'm going to start off with you again, if you like. It's asking, what do you think is the most significant challenge that across the public sector in Wales lies? Is it A, in deciding what action to take, or B, implementation after sort of the decision has been made? We've got a couple of questions based around that. So it's a good question.
It's a very good question, because both of those issues are highly relevant.
Yeah.
I think we are at the moment, it's around deciding what action to take and getting citizen and political buy-in to the action that needs to be taken. And, difficult decisions would seem to work against that you will get, lots of people having counter views. But that's where the public engagement, the involvement of members, and I actually mean all members here, not just the cabinet members,
okay,
in getting out there and feeding information to and from the people in their wards. To me, that's the key area. It is around deciding what needs to be done and communicating that to stakeholders, be they staff or citizens.
Thank you. I'm going to draw this part of the question to an end, if that's all right. Can I say thank you, folks, for the questions that are coming in so far. Please keep them coming in. What I'll try and do, I'll try and just summarise some of the questions for the tail end of this webinar, if that's all right. I'd like to now move on to question 3, if that's all right, Anthony. And simply, how prepared are the Welsh Public Services to deliver transformation?
I think they are better prepared than they were a few years ago, but there is still some way to go. I mean, you know, sitting here as a citizen, I haven't felt any cuts in public services for me personally. I kind of feel they're still to come, and that actually once they start to kick in, that's when people will start to feel them pinch. So for me, public bodies are putting together plans, deciding what action to take. Once that's done, then the implementation phase will throw up a whole range of new challenges and difficulties.
Okay, thank you for that, Anthony. Mark, can I come to you on this?
Yeah, certainly. I think authorities in Wales are reasonably well prepared for this, but they do also need help. If I just describe some of the things we've been doing in Wrexham and then what we're going to move on to do, really. We have been doing targeted financial savings or percentage cuts, and in our proposed 15-16 budget, that's resulted in services having reductions of between 5 and 12%. But alongside that, we are developing alternative delivery models. We have set up a cleaning company which allows income generation. We're working strongly on setting up or engaging with a number of trusts to deliver services, and we've got one mutual which is being considered. And that's enabling us to stop directly delivering our leisure service, heritage service. Community centres and school crossing patrols have already been transferred to community councils to run. We are working very hard on digital and self-service systems, particularly in the revenues and benefits and HR areas. And I think one of the questions earlier was about assets, where we have reduced the number of buildings we have. We are doing things on agile working and concentrating on increasing income. But we do need help, and we recognise that. So we have engaged a reshaping partner to bring some pace and appetite to what we're doing, really.
And are you finding that wearing the hat of Society of Welsh Treasurers, are you finding that's replicated throughout your colleagues in Wales? I
think everybody is facing the shared challenge, and I think what's important is that everyone has the shared learning as a result of that, and that in Society of Welsh Treasurers we do work hard to get speakers in. We've had seminars with Wales Audit Office. We've got meetings this week with representatives coming along to share what's been happening. In fact, Guy came to a meeting last year to share what was happening in England. We had someone from Essex, I think it was, to keep everybody up to speed with best practice.
Anthony, did you want to come back in on that?
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of emphasise one of the points Mark was making there in terms of they had a partner supporting them in this. And I think it's vital that organisations recognise where necessary that they may not have all of the skills or experience, or is it the necessary drive to be able to push this through. And again, it comes down to the fact that, you know, alongside transformation or whatever, service delivery still has to take place. Still required to deliver services to the in some cases, the most needy people in our communities. That has to happen. There's a risk that people get distracted by transformation and don't do service delivery, or concentrate on service delivery and don't do transformation. So I think it is important to recognise where either capacity or capability may be lacking, and to buy that in or get some partnership or some working either between authorities or with other partners.
And that goes back to your opening point that you're making at the top of this webinar about ensuring that you've got the right people, the right skill sets to deliver in this sort of in this environment of transformation.
Yeah, and that's another way of obtaining that through some sort of partnering arrangement.
Okay, thank you, Deborah. Guy, may I turn to you?
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. So there should be a slide coming up now with some of my thoughts. I'll focus on the first one really, and this has already been mentioned really. But when I think back to October 2010 in English local government, there was a real spectrum in terms of planning and the planning horizon. You had those that were on the case and they had various scenarios across the medium term for potential funding reductions. To those at the other end who had their heads in the sand and sort of saying, so much uncertainty, we couldn't possibly, you know, because of the uncertainty, we can't plan, and we can't do scenarios. And I'd say, well, actually, that's even more important reason to do scenarios and to plan. And we recognise this, and we published a report called 2020 Vision last October. which built on our tipping point series of reports, recognising that local government has an ongoing and critical debate to be had about its future. And we set out a number of scenarios for what local government might look like, some of them positive, some of them less positive. And whilst the focus was English local government, it's a report that is relevant across local government and perhaps beyond in terms of public services as well. So I'd recommend having a look at that if you haven't already. But when we think about that planning, we think about Anthony's point around the sort of the day job. One of the things that local government in England has struggled with, particularly with chief officers and others involved in service delivery, has been getting their heads up from the firefighting day to day. It's been really difficult for them to think about next week, let alone next year. And indeed, being able to firefight successfully has rewarded them. I mean, they're in a senior position because of their ability to manage the day-to-day. And I think it all goes back to perhaps what is the emerging theme of the webinar, which is around leadership and the culture of that leadership. And just one final point on this, those local authorities that have particularly volatile demand-led services, social care, has been a real particular issue within local government. So the ability for an effective forecasting, sensitivity analysis, demand management is something that many in local government still continue to struggle with.
Guy, thank you for that. And you mentioned a scenario planning, and I'd like to share with the listeners that Councillor Ben Curran of Sheffield, they've adopted the approach of scenario planning. They've taken a scenario where they've got a sort of someone who's 6 years of age, what will happen when they're 36, 56, 96. They've taken a number of scenarios and talked through what impact that would have on their services. But for Cabinet members and members listening in, he said there are 5 things he would really like to share his learning. First one is political risk. He said the scale and pace of what they went through in Sheffield, no one has ever seen this before. He said it was just absolutely scary, and so you're taking a deep breath and taking a plunge was something you just had to do. But he said never underestimate the political risk. Financial risk. You need to be assured, he said, that your proposed cuts are actually achievable. We tested, and we tested at various officer level as well, and we also cross-checked with individual cabinet members. Scrutiny played a huge part in this. Informal scrutiny to start off with, which obviously that's music to the ears of the Wales Audit Office, and but informal scrutiny played a big part where they sort of talked various scenarios through, and then they took it to the wider party itself. And then the impact on the officers in terms of testing, they said, can it really, can that service really be delivered? We're not experts, he said, so we rely very heavily on the officer sort of support that we had. But also, he said, don't ever ignore your gut instinct. If there was something that I didn't quite understand, he said, there isn't such a thing as a stupid question in the situation. He said, it would be stupid not to ask it. Also, we mentioned about good practice already in this webinar, and he said we went and saw what other organisations of similar sort of size and sort of location, what were they doing, how were they doing. We often had discussions like that. And then we've also mentioned about public engagement. He said we tested our changes with the public right across, particularly some of the library models, because they weren't really conventional. I'm not sure how everyone feels about having a library in a local pub, but when there are no other options, we did ask the public, and so we felt that was really important. Yeah, Guy, you've got some comments to come back on that?
Yeah, I mean, just picking up on Ina's point around sort of finance scrutiny, we did a report with Centre for Public Scrutiny Wales that was aimed at Welsh local government, was published last July, I think it was, called Raising the Stakes. So that was lots of good practice suggestions around just the whole aspects of member scrutiny in relation to financial planning and financial management. And just one final point to pick up on Ina's comment around Sheffield. Done some work there, and I know the council, and I'm really impressed with the work they've been doing around strategic financial planning, because they've introduced some outcome-based financial planning. And what's sort of alluded to by Ina earlier, but what's really interesting is that it is city-based outcomes. So it doesn't mean that the city council is necessarily delivering or responsible for those And I think that's fairly innovative
Yes,
within local government.
We've got a couple of questions coming in. So Anthony, I'll direct to you in the first case again, if I may. So if we think about the 80-20 rule, would it not make good business sense to focus transformation activity on the biggest cost centres, for example, social services and education?
I suppose from a financial accountant point of view, yes, it would. If you transform the big spending services to view that, with the view of providing those services effectively but much more cheaply, then that will save a lot of money. I think the other point to bear in mind here is some of the smaller spending services perhaps have an impact on a greater number of people perhaps. I don't know, I'm not a local government chief executive or local government officer, but I know from my own point of view, I haven't needed to access social services, but I do use the library services and leisure services, for example. So you could perhaps impact upon greater numbers of people in the community by looking at those wider services. But from a purely financial point of view, then yes, if you can transform the high-spending services to make them, as effective but cheaper, then that will have a greater impact.
Okay, thank you. Mark, you want to come in here?
I do. I don't think you've got any choice really other than to concentrate on those high spending services. I mentioned at the beginning of the session that Wrexham's budget was 227 million. Well, of that, 76 million relates to schools, and in Wales we have to increase schools spend by 0.6% for next year. And coupled with some other areas that you can't influence because we've got contracts and so on, then you've only got around 90 to 100,000 revenue budget to play with in terms of the savings that you've got to make. Social care, children's and adults, budget is around 54 million. So you've got to make some inroads to that if you're going to make the level of savings that we need to, really. And that is one of our work streams in terms of reviewing the social care, trying to move to leading practice models of social care and taking demand out of the system, really.
Can I ask, for those who are listening in, what are your thoughts on this? Are you adopting a similar approach to what Mark has just alluded to? While we're waiting for those questions, can I ask Guy to come back on this? We'd very much like to hear what your thoughts are in terms of what Mark was saying there, if that's okay.
Thanks. I'd agree with colleagues on the panel that it makes absolute sense to focus on the sort of 80-20 Pareto principle, if I remember right. That's what it's called. I think the caveat to that is around the earlier discussion around public engagement and also sort of political priorities. I can think of one council in England that I recently worked for, and members' priorities were around discretionary services. And a number of those were in the 20 rather than the 80. And that led to quite significant tension between Cabinet and Chief Executive Management Board, which had to be managed. And I suppose one of the points on that is within the 80, you may have some of the the non-controllable spend. So, for example, large outsourcing contracts, and that's something that English local authorities have struggled with because it's seen as being non-controllable. We've got this 25-year contract. It's legal. How can we go back? But some authorities now there is progress in developing the commercial skills to be able to renegotiate some of the terms of those contracts and put them into the controllable box rather than the uncontrollable spend. So there are caveats, but absolutely it makes sense.
Okay, thank you, Mark. I'd like to move on to the next question, if that's all right now. So question 4. So given what we've just heard, it's inevitable going forward that partnerships and collaboration will form key elements of Welsh Public Service. So how will organisations effectively manage those arrangements, champion openness, raise understanding, and improve engagement? Anthony, can I ask you to open?
Yeah, I mean, both Mark and Guy have already alluded to this. Guy in terms of citywide outcomes in Sheffield, and Mark in terms of the collaboration with other bodies in Wrexham. And actually, I think it's one of the problems as an auditor is that we statutorily required to audit organisations. Generally speaking, certainly from a financial audit point of view, not quite so much on performance audit where we can take a system view. And I think it's critical that both public service organisations and indeed auditors start to take that broader view and to look at the implications of decisions in one organisation for the wider community. Now, if I just take a very simplistic example from my point of view, an organisation might decide to, a local authority might decide where it's going to close the leisure centres, can't afford them anymore. I realise that they're looking for alternative delivery models, but let's just say they decide to close them. What impact is that going to have on the health and well-being of the local population? Are we going to say, an increase in obesity and therefore more call on the health service, that sort of thing? So that's a very simplistic example, but I think one which does illustrate that any decision that a public authority takes that is designed to impact upon the lives of citizens will impact on other public service providers. And I think there needs to be a great deal of engagement between public organisations in Wales around the best way of delivering services within this sort of scenario.
Okay. I guess, Martin, in some ways, I could sum up what you're saying in some ways, as saying that you were sort of talking about the well-being of the future generations bill in all its intents and purposes, really.
Well, yeah, I mean, if we look, the role of public services has to be to support the individuals in the community and the wider community. Most of the time, organisations their performance is measured on what they do as an individual organisation, not necessarily on the impact and outcomes they have on the whole community. And I think, kind of a utopian view would be that everyone would be working together to a set of key performance indicators, which might mean that organisation X might not be performing as well, but it's supporting another organisation that is helping the community. But that's, as I say, a rather utopian view.
Thank you for that view, nonetheless. Mark, can I come over to you on this one?
Yes, I think working in partnership and collaboration is probably one of the areas that needs to be developed even much faster and further in Wales. I think one of the reasons it perhaps hasn't moved as far as it could is that it is one of the harder areas, and councils have been working on their own internal efficiencies and proposals they can control the governance of. Because once you start working with other organisations, then you've got to have shared cultures and behaviours and shared governance models, which is quite difficult. I think that the structural reform that's been proposed is having an impact on this. And I know, just to prove we are live, there's been announcements this morning, and that may alter that and enable us to do or to re-engage in some of the collaboration aspects. But an authority would need to be prepared to give up sovereignty on one area to enable them to share and work together more. So I think this is an area that is challenging local government, and it is going to need to get to grips with it if it's going to make the savings that are required.
So in England, have they managed to sort of get to grips with sort of collaboration and partnership working there?
I think the journey is sort of ongoing. I mean, I'm a fan of BS 11000, which is the British standard on collaboration. That's just to say the concepts of that. I'm not suggesting that public service bodies sort of get accredited in it like they some do on the quality standards, but it's the concepts, and they're all about effective collaboration, how you can drive efficiency through collaboration. And I guess my slide may be coming up now with some points. And one word I've not put on there is trust, but essentially it's about trust and the maturity of that partnership. And so therefore, in the question here, we've got championing openness. That's not just about public transparency, that is openness between the organisations that are collaborating, as far as I'm concerned. So having clearly defined roles, having effective governance, understanding how you manage risk across the collaboration spectrum is really, really important, because without that type of, those sorts of concepts, then there'll be inefficiencies, and and potentially there are risks that may lead to the collaboration not delivering its objectives. So I think that openness is really important within and outside. And in terms of England, there has been progress, and the rise of alternative service delivery models, I guess, is a sort of a marker of the increase in effective collaboration, but the journey is not complete by any means.
Okay, thank you for that, Guy. Councillor Ben Curran from Sheffield shared his thoughts on this, and he said it's about willingness. The idea is sort of great in theory, he said, but sort of the reality is the sort of organisations were clinging to their budgets, and it was about taking a very brave step that we had to show leadership as a local government, that we were willing to share our resources to kick-start it. It was hard, he said. It was really hard because it's sort of, everyone likes to manage their own purse, and so having to hand over that, and he said it took a massive leap of faith. Guy talked about trust there, and that's something else that Ben said. Trust is so important. It cannot be underestimated how important that actually was. And also, strong governance, being clear on whose responsibility on their roles and what happens if income is generated and how it's going to be shared. I mean, what about there were some barriers about that, and also, he said, relationships are based on trust. So working hard at those relationships right at the very beginning, because he said, rest assured, you will come across you'll hit some challenges, and you will need to have the strength of those relationships to try and help get things back on course. So working on the relationships that that are going to enable those changes are absolutely vital. And he said, when I asked him if there was one key message in relationship to partnerships and collaboration, what would that be? He said, everything. He said, it's not about a one-size-fits-all approach. He said, get engaged with willing partners. Get the easy wins done first, but make sure that relationships are strong and they're in place. So, like he said earlier, when you do hit issues, they can be resolved as they arise. This also applies to the private sector engagement. He said, I was quite surprised what he said about this. He said, private sector doesn't seem to be as aligned to austerity as local government in the main, but then when someone shows willing in the private sector to renegotiate a contract, for maybe, for example, he used the example of the HR contract where they're outsourced with Capita. They were willing to renegotiate the contract for a slimmed-down contract by showing willingness. Sheffield in the longer term are more willing to work with them as partners, so they were also playing the long game as well. We've got quite a few questions coming in on this. Thank you very much for the questions. Please do keep them coming in. I will like to kick off about the question. I'd like to open back to the listeners at large, if you like. There's a question that comes in that I said, there's a good history of officer collaboration. How much is done at the political level to ensure further success? So I think I'd actually have to hand that back to the listeners at large for the moment. And if you'd like to share your observations, we'll gladly read them out. The next question I'd like to ask the panel, and I guess it's for Anthony and Guy for this one again. How can the Wales Audit Office assist councils to transform, and is now the right time to reduce the burden of inspection? And there's a second element to this one, Anthony, as well. Could any money be saved by reducing the burden and be ploughed back into public services? You can tell that this is live now, can't you?
Yes, I can. I'm quite happy to take that question. For a start, I don't see the audit work as a burden. I see it as providing a vital element of public accountability, and I think that's very important, particularly going forward when we're talking about governance and about transparency and openness, that there is accountability, there is somebody there who either the public can go to, or indeed, as happens sometimes, members can go to, or we pick things up ourselves to look at. In terms of other aspects, there are elements of our work which are prescribed, which if we had a free rein we would probably do in a different way to make them more effective and add more value. But I also have to say that the cost, again, from Wales Audit Office point of view, the cost of what we do is very, very small compared to the overall budgets. I think, and again, you would expect me to say this, if you were to scrap all the audit now, what you would lose would be far more than the relatively small amount of finance that you would gain out of that. Now, I'm not sure if colleagues listening would necessarily agree with me on that, but certainly I think auditors provide a vital public service in that way.
Mark, and you would like to come?
I was just going to comment that I'll take that back to our audit committee because this question comes up at every one, really.
It does, and I have to say, I'm quite happy for us to get asked that question and for as an organisation to be challenged on fees and what service we're providing. And I would like to think that members were equally challenging of all the other aspects of spend within the council. Any council, not just Wrexham Council.
We're having a number of questions coming in about local service boards and their roles in all this. So I'm trying to sort of pull that question together, those questions together. Could and should local service boards in Wales do more, sort of, in terms of developing partnership and joint delivery models? Can I come to you on this, Anthony? There's another one coming in just about local service boards and the roles of the local service boards as well.
I think there need to be. I'm not sure if local service boards is the answer to the question. I think there needs to be mechanisms for organisations to work together and share information together. It's probably not particularly relevant what you call them, and I wouldn't want any organisation, any board or any facility that was set up to become just a talking shop and people get together and discuss things. These collaborations and partnerships need actually to take decisions and start delivering on things. I'm not sure that necessarily answers the question. There needs to be some structure, and if there's a structure there, it needs to be effective in supporting that wider service delivery.
Okay, thank you. We've got a couple of responses coming back to sort of the history of officer collaboration and how much is done at political level. So if you'd like, I'll take those at the end. If anybody else has got any more observations they want to make on that, I'll bring that back in at the end if that's okay. Can we now move on to the next question? So question 5. This question came about from, we had delegates send questions in advance. We've had it in as part of the panel questions. Quite a thorny question, actually, so I'll be interested to hear the delegates' response to this because it's been quite varied in terms of the kind of question. So we've kind of structured it quite neutral as we possibly can. So, Anthony, how do Welsh public bodies propose to manage reserves going forward? Reserves are being maintained, or some of them being increased year on year, but is there an effective use of reserves?
I think people, and I use that in the widest sense, need to understand the purpose of reserves. Reserves, certainly from my point of view, are built up by an organisation ostensibly as a backstop for any unforeseen circumstances in terms of general reserves. There are also earmarked reserves which will be used for specific things. And I think when we were sort of discussing before the webinar began, we were discussing the fact that actually reserves are an important part to a medium-term financial strategy. And it's not just having those reserves, it's how you think you're going to need to spend them as part of that strategy. Now, on one hand, and this gets relayed to me sometimes as an auditor, it's and actually from members of the public, often challenging the budget setting in organisations. They've got millions and millions of pounds in reserves. Why aren't they using that? And I think there is a communication issue for organisations to get over to the people as to why they've got reserves, why they're holding them, what the purpose is, to make it clear. Most organisations are required, or it would be prudent for them to hold some reserves. Does there come a point at which those reserves have to be dipped into? Quite possibly, but as part of the strategy. And the other thing to bear in mind is once you've taken money out of a reserve, unless you put it back in, that money is not available for anything else. So you have to be very careful about what that money is used for. And again, authorities and organisations will have strategies about how to use reserves, will be clear on what it's going to be used for, and that will have gone through a scrutiny and overview process that should arrive at the right answer for individual authority.
Thank you for that, Anthony. Can I hand over to you, Mark?
Okay, I agree that reserves are an important component for the financial planning framework. There's certainly no panacea for the financial problems created by austerity. What I'm certain on is those decisions around reserves have to be made at the local level. They must be left to the local professional statutory decision makers. And clearly if risks are and uncertainty are increasing, then you may have reasons why reserves would go up. You've also got reserves used for self-insurance, for capital investment, business transformation and workforce planning. On local authorities' books you've got school reserves and in some cases housing reserves. So in some cases the variation between reserves can just be down to major capital projects. Wales Audit Office did actually do a report in 2012 on reserves and emphasised that there could be improved reporting on the management of reserves, and I echo that and support that. And that is an area we need to work on, because what's important about reserves is not the levels of them, but the openness, transparency and accountability associated with them, and there may be benefit of more information in the statement of accounts as well. They're not a way to fix the long-term austerity pressures.
Okay, thank you for that, Mark. We've got some questions coming in responding to Anthony's initial comments, but can I hand over to Guy first to talk through his observations in relation to reserves?
Yeah, well, in terms of England, many English councils and indeed schools have increased their reserve levels since 2010, and the Secretary of State has been critical of both. And I'd agree with colleagues' comments thus far. Just understanding the level of reserves is not particularly helpful. It's understanding what those reserves are going to be used for. One of the questions that's come in says, should all organisations have some level of reserves to be used as investor save funds? I think the answer is not for me, or perhaps anybody on the panel to say, well, that's yes or no. It is, as the panel has already said, it is down to local decisions and local circumstances. I mean, SIPFA, they changed their policy a few years ago. They used to set, I think it was like 5% of net revenue spend, and then they changed it to, it's on the advice of the Section 151 based on local circumstances, and that's something I absolutely support. A reasonable level of reserves is a good indicator of financial resilience over the medium term, and low levels of reserve, I don't know if my slides have come up yet, but it can limit an organisation's ability to invest, maintain that the services through the transformation period, and generally withstand financial shocks. So having a good use of reserves and a good level of reserves is critical during austerity. Final comment from me is that one of the things that's been difficult is to benchmark reserves, and that's because there is no standard terminology. One sort of transformation earmark reserve is named completely different to another council, and they're both named completely different to another council. So we've struggled to do the detailed benchmarking when you drill down a bit into the reserves, and particularly earmark reserves.
Thank you for that, Guy. Councillor Ben Cohen's observations were this, where he said, as a member, he said, managing a declining offer to the public and increasing reserves it's not a very palatable position to be in. So it's about having very, very strong officer discussions and understanding what was going on and continuing understanding what was going on. He said, I never really understood the amount of discussion that we actually had in relation to reserves until the transformation element happened in Sheffield. We used to have regular weekly meetings understanding the implications of it, because as more and more information became aware, so the implications on reserves was becoming more and more difficult for me to get my head around. I'm not a financial specialist, I'm a member, and having good member dialogue and get them to make me understand what's going on was absolutely key. And it is a political risk to this, he said. So he said, my key message would be, it's not about the reserves per se, it's about understanding the underlying risk that goes if you do decide to cut down services and increase your reserves. The implications of this is huge. So it's about having clear roles and understanding what the officer and member role is and having that guidance. He said he can't underestimate the importance of having that continuing dialogue with the officers.
But I think that the key point for me really is what Anthony mentioned, there needs to be a strategy for the use of reserves, and that strategy needs to form part of the Council's medium-term financial strategy, and that's something that is developing in English local government.
Yeah, and I support that, and I think we need to develop that in Wales, but we spend too long talking about reserves, really. I mean, in Wrexham's terms, the reserves, the general reserves, are around 7 million, which would keep the authority going for just over a week. You know, the amounts aren't as big as they're made out.
Okay, thank you for that. We've got a couple of questions coming in about reserves. The first one is about sort of past failures in local government sector are generally related to service or corporate governance issues and not financial failure. So is there too much caution about prudent use of resources to pump prime long-term cost-saving initiatives?
I'm not sure from Guy's experience, but certainly from my point of view, you know, in Wales we haven't seen a local authority fail financially, although in other parts of the world there have been authorities, in America for example, where the councils have failed financially and have in effect been bankrupt as a result of that. So you know, I think it's right to be cautious, particularly as this you know, period of austerity, economic crisis where we are, is likely to continue for quite some time. The pressures or the risks of financial failure will increase.
Okay, thank you, Anthony. Mark?
I think you've got to have pump priming of initiatives, particularly on the digital side of things. They are expensive, and you've got to invest to get the regular ongoing savings afterwards. But you can't do that, and if the thing fails, just ignore that. You've got to ensure that there is adequate governance, and that is one area where, you know, I agree that the auditors do look at us closely, and they do corporate assessments on the way in which we're working. And I think you do need to ensure that although you're trying new things, you've always got an eye on governance aspects.
Okay. So in England, did that happen that way?
Well, I think, sort of in my view, and I think it's more generally Grant Thornton's view, is it's unlikely we feel that there will be a bankruptcy similar to Detroit and other local authorities in the US, and that's partly because the model of funding is different between the two countries, but also if there is, I mean, there's been some high-profile cases where local authorities have got into financial distress, but there are occasions where central government, like is more common in the NHS, for example, would step in and help out financially. We see that happening. We don't see local authorities, and it would only be a minority at risk going bankrupt. In terms of pump priming, it's, you know, managed in the right way. I think it's important, and a couple of points on an earlier slide I've not mentioned is about effective due diligence and sort of business and robust business case development, and that really is critical. So if you are investing in pump priming in a particular project or program, the due diligence and the business case has to be effective. And one of the things that the sector is still not great on, in my view, is sort of around benefits realisation. So we think about the governance overlap. It's the monitoring of the delivery. In fact, it's not just local government. It's all sectors. Yeah. When any review I've ever seen of change, it's normally about 3/4 of change projects fail. Benefits are not realised. So it's not particularly unique to public services. But being able to have that effective monitoring of benefits realisation is absolutely crucial.
Thank you very much, Guy. It's now over to you folks. Given what you've heard that's been discussed during this webinar, what support would you like from the professions in relation to sort of facing financial challenges? I'm going to ask Anthony to sort of round up in a minute, but whilst Anthony's putting some work together in relation to what we've been discussing, what support do you want from the Wales Audit Office? What support do you want from the professions? And what about sort of in the wider sense of, in terms of maybe the local service boards? Because quite a few of you mentioned sort of the role of the local service board. Would you like to share your thoughts with us on that? So Anthony, we've talked about we're using this webinar to start the discussion about the challenges public services in Wales are going to be facing. there's been a bit of sort of focus on local government, but it's much wider than just local government here, isn't it? We're talking about the involvement of service delivery from the voluntary, from trust organisations, so voluntary sector, trust, hybrid models, working collaboratively. What's the reality of this?
Yeah, I mean, it is pretty much, from my point of view, a whole system issue, because whether you are, maybe an individual or an individual family unit, right up to the biggest public service organisation in Wales, everybody's feeling the pinch, to varying degrees, depending on where you sit. So austerity is real, and it needs to be addressed. I don't think it can be addressed by any one organisation working alone. I think it does need collaboration and partnership, not least with local communities. I hope that this webinar has ignited some thoughts around what for me seem like some of the key themes in this, which is around culture, having the right culture to be able to deliver the transformation, getting help, wherever that help comes from, in terms of driving the agenda forward, and then having engagement, openness, transparency and engagement, which hopefully would then lead to both political and public buy-in to the plans that are being put forward. So that for me is kind of like the overall picture.
Thank you very much indeed. Mark, can I have some closing thoughts from you, please?
Yeah, I just think that change of culture is very difficult and very hard. We have got an initiative going in Wrexham called Together in Wrexham, which is a new approach to get more people to take responsibility for what goes on in their communities. It works hard at the relationships and the quality of life in the area where they live, and is involved in trying to make those communities more sustainable for the future and empower those local residents to make a difference. And it can cover anything from volunteering at the local sports club to community clean-ups and helping out at the Child Scout or music club or whatever. But the effort involved in getting the community to take responsibility and to work within the community council and moving that culture is something that you're not going to do over the next couple of years, and you are into the next 25 years to have that shift, really.
Thank you for that. Anthony, would you like to come back on that?
Yeah, again, I think Mark makes a very important point there. And I don't know to what extent we know the skills that exist within our communities to be able to do some of those things. Yeah. My view is that they almost certainly do exist, those skills, but we're not tapping into them. And I think that's where the engagement comes in. And as Mark said, that the initiative in Wrexham, people with particular skills doing particular things for the benefit of the community. I think that's vital.
Thank you for that. Guy, some closing thoughts for you?
I guess the key thing for me, particularly from thinking about English local government over the last few years, is do not underestimate the challenge of what lies ahead for at least the next Parliament. And I do think for me a bit of a theme from today has been around leadership and culture. It's not an easy solution, but it's absolutely critical. I mean, over the years, I've done various sort of root causing workshops and sessions with local government, other public sector bodies, and I can't think of one when you root cause a particular issue that doesn't actually get back to leadership. It's always been there. It's always been critical, but it's arguably even more critical than it has been.
Thank you for that. Thanks very much, Guy. We've got a couple of questions coming in about the role of the Welsh Government in all of this, and and also the other sectors, voluntary sector, police, fire, and health. Anthony, you talked earlier on about it's an all systems approach. How do you see this actually panning out?
Yeah, I mean, it is an all organisation, the whole system approach. I don't think. I don't know to the extent which we currently understand the way in which different things interact in the communities, and I think I think individual organisations may have a view on that, but whether they've got the whole picture, I think remains to be seen. So, yeah, I think again, if we're talking about, local services, even if we're talking about local services provided by a local authority, I don't particularly see that as just a local authority problem, because, as I said, because of the interconnections and the knock-on effects on everything. And similarly, things may be happening in other organisations that would impact upon local government. And that's why I think the whole sort of system approach is absolutely vital.
Okay. Anthony, thank you for that. In terms of next steps, this is what's going to happen next. The broadcast today has been recorded. We'll divide this, the responses to each question up. So if you only wanted to listen or share with colleagues who weren't able to listen in today, one question and the responses to that, you're able to do that. We'll also be doing short video clips of the panel to share their thoughts and summaries, which you can use to act as a sort of, as Anthony said, a start of discussion to get views coming across. Suffice for me to say, can I say my thanks to all panel members for taking part today, much appreciated. As delegates who are listening in, we are work in progress here on webinars. You'll get an opportunity to share your feedback, and this seminar today is as a direct result of delegates from previous webinars emailing us in asking to have a webinar on this discussion. So my question to you is this: what subject would you like to see next? Are there any particular panel members you'd like to see involved? Please share with us, and we'll do our very best to try and enable that. Thank you very much indeed. P'nawn da I chi os bydd â chwilio Cymru. Hwyl fawr a diolch.